kind of idea. And what I reject in postmodernism, though, is the idea that there is no substratum of enduring human nature, of human of that. I mean, I think there clearly are a range of needs and impulses and desires and activities that go with being human, just as there are for other animals. And how could that be otherwise unless you thought that something like a transcendental God had gifted human beings with a soul, or some kind of freedom that other animals didn't have. So, I mean, I don't think that. I mean, so
yeah, there's a radical uncertainty in jettisoning a theistic vision of the world, and I think what I take away from your work, both here and in Straw Dogs, is that we are largely uncomfortable with that uncertainty and the messiness of life as it is, and we want to make it conform to some kind of ideal and
meaningful pattern.
And I think the skeptical, a rational pattern. And I actually, one of the other books I've been slowly wrestling with, even though it's very short, is Max Horkheimer's book, Reason, Eclipse of Reason.
Yes.
And he's really, I love it because it's not one of these classical philosophical texts. It's actually, it feels like a diary to me, like of him just wrestling with, how did we get here? Like, how did we go from Comte's vision of a, humanity rising in, from its primitive nature into something beautiful and progressive into Nazi concentration camps. And he's saying there's something about this celebration or this almost worship of the human intellect and human reason that has led us astray. Am I on the right track there?
Yes, I think so. I mean, there may not be an inevitable kind of, the Holocaust and the Gulag may not have been inevitable, but there were elements within the European and Western tradition of modern rationalism mixed with these vast kind of moral hopes inherited from Christianity, which didn't exist in the ancient world. There were elements within that which led to which led to the catastrophes that then happened. Maybe, as I say, not by strict inevitability, but it worked out that way.
For it. There were some blind spots inherent in it that allowed for
Well,
those.
you could even, let's take it a different way. You could see, I mean, many of the regimes that have existed throughout history have been criminal in various ways. They've been tyrannous in various ways. But modern totalitarianism, which I sort of date as starting with the Jacobins, is different because the aims of the different forms of modern totalitarianism is to reshape society completely, or even to reshape humanity, humankind, to produce a higher level of human beings.
Like an engineering.
Re-engineer humankind, and that could have a right-wing form in which much of existing humanity is rejected entirely as being inferior, so they're fit only for enslavement or even mass extermination, or you can have a seemingly more egalitarian view like that in the early Soviet Union, in which large numbers of what were called former persons, that was the legal phrase they used, could be stripped of all their rights, including rights to food and so on. They can be dispensed with because they belong, whether they're peasants or intellectuals or priests or whoever they happen to be, they can be dispensed with because they don't fit into the higher humanity which is being fashioned. They're just the human remnants of a more primitive type of human development. So they can be kind of got rid of.
I have two questions that are related that I want to sort of get out and then let you sort of reflect on them. One is if let's say let's say you're right and that modern secular humanists have this sort of positivistic view of the world, that it can be improved on a trajectory and so forth. Like what's so
and that the improvements are cumulative. That's the key
that they're cumulative, right? And that we're sort of there's
in the
a
way that the growth of knowledge is cumulative.
Okay, right.
That's what they think.
That human knowledge is growing, and that moral development happens kind of coterminous with that. And that there's a teleology to human history, much like Christianity. So one part of the question is, what's wrong with that? Let's say that gives a former Christian some anchor in their transition out of religion into the secular world. So what? Like, And I've read some reviews of your book where other reviewers are saying, okay, maybe you're right, John, but so what? Like, why is this a big deal?
Well, one thing is it undermines the claims of the more aggressive of these humanists and atheists that they are post-religious.
I see. But what if they aren't? Like, what if secular humanism can't get out, as I said earlier, can't escape the gravitational pull of theism or a kind of religionism? What's wrong with that?
One thing, my view is that myths of one kind or another are inevitable in human life. They might be personal myths connected with family history or one's own biography. The writer J.G. Ballard, who I knew quite well in the last years of his life, used to talk about the way he'd reprocessed his early traumatic experiences in Shanghai into a kind of personal mythology which appeared in his fiction. That was a kind of strictly personal mythology, if you like, of low-flying planes and empty swimming pools and whatnot. He turned them into these experiences he'd had, I think, into a kind of through a kind of psychological alchemy into symbols, which for him were very positive by that time, because they had a lot of beauty in them. So it can be a personal mythology or the mythology of a great historic traditional religion, or you're saying, well, what's wrong with the myths of secular humanism? What's wrong with them is they're shallower than. I mean, if you want a rich, broad, more than personal mythology, I'd say take up a traditional religion, because that's they're there. They've been around a long time. Some of the myths, like the myth of Genesis, seems to me almost inexhaustibly profound. But don't pretend that you're living without myths, because if you do, you'll panic quite easily when the myth is falsified by experience. I mean, the advantage of the Christian mythologies and theistic mythologies is that they're harder to falsify.
Right.
I mean, they may, as you have done in your own life, you may move away from them for various reasons, and that, I think, makes it more interesting to talk to you than it is to talk to someone who's only ever had one set of beliefs and myths. But the trouble with the secular myths of liberal humanism is that they're repeatedly falsified, and they're repeatedly, people who hold to them, if they're panic when history starts going the wrong way. So, I mean, if you think of John Stuart Mill, I mean, I spent about 20 years in another life kind of working on John Stuart Mill. A very interesting thinker in many ways, but a lot wrong with it. But if you think, absolutely none of the major upheavals of the 20th century was anticipated in his work. But not only was it not anticipated, they weren't even possible. There could be nothing like Bolshevism or Nazism. There could be nothing like the ethnic nationalism, which is now reemerged in many parts of Europe, and also nativism, which has reemerged in America. The test of a myth is not its truth, but its truthfulness to deeper human experience and more enduring human experience. And the test is it truthful to human experience in many circumstances and in many over long periods of time? And in that sense, I think, if you want a myth, if that's what you're looking for, a myth that's more than purely personal, then you're better off with the traditional myths. I mean, I think Bertrand Russell, towards the end of his life, is kind of a great atheist. He said, I'm not sure this is always true, by the way, but he said, religions are like wines, they get better as they age. And liberal humanism is quite a kind of brief, short-lived religion. It might not be around for very much longer as well. It could vanish the way many religions have done. After all, most of the religions that humans have had in their history have vanished.
Well, one last question, and I think one of my concerns about the positivists that we've been talking about, people like, and I'll put a name on it just this once, and I know you have a long-running debate with Steven Pinker, yes. So part of the problem I have with him, and I see him on Twitter and so forth, he says, this is the least violent era that we've ever had. So the implication of this to me in a modern context is, I know that your son was just shot in the street by the police officers, but don't worry, because this is the least violent we've ever been.
Or a terrorist.
Right, exactly. And it's really not very comforting, or not. I mean, not that we're only looking for comfort; we're looking also for solutions. But it's not really useful to say to someone who's experiencing an uptick in violence in their life. Say you live in the Gaza Strip and you're being reassured that this is the most peaceful humanity has ever been. And so likewise, one of my concerns about some of the possible takeaway from your work is that the opposite might be taken away, which is, the vagaries of human existence. It's sort of absurd. There's no meaning to be found in it. Therefore, as you said, I think on page 1 of your book, speaking about previous atheists in history, that they were not looking for cosmic meaning. They were content with the world as they found it. And I immediately think about people who can't afford to be content with the world as they find it. Like what answer do they have?
Well, what answers did people have in ancient Greece or in the ancient tragedies or in Shakespeare what do actually people do when they're up against the wall? Did they reach for a copy of John Stuart Mill? They say,
or Enlightenment now.
300 years from now, this will all be sorted out. I'm going to be shot, they might be saying. My family is going to be murdered. But still, that's not really so. I mean, what have they actually done? I mean, by the way, the idea that we're getting. I don't want to go into the statistical stuff. I think Nassim Taleb has criticized many of the statistical errors in Pinker's account. But one of the sort of features he basically represents war as a kind of vice of primitive societies, which I find. It's both obviously false, but it's also almost obscene. I mean, if you think of the Southeast Asia, for example, like all human societies, it was imperfect. But before the wars of the mid-20th century, before the French wars and then the American wars, and before the French wars, there was the Japanese. Before those wars, it was relatively highly peaceful. There were local and national conflicts of various kinds, but nothing like the mass murder that then took place when the neo-colonial wars of the mid-20th century leading up to the Vietnam War occurred. To attribute that terrible 30 years war to the backwardness of that society is just a sort of an incredible fantastical insult, as well as being kind of clearly false. They were just caught up in a kind of vortex of global conflict, and the, in many ways, rather beautiful societies that existed before were destroyed, completely destroyed. So it's an astonishingly, but it's characteristic. I've argued in many places. His audience consists of rattled liberals. They're anxious liberals who look around the world and it's not going the way they think. So they're reassured to hear that it isn't getting less violent. To the extent that it is less violent, that's, I think, mainly because of nuclear weapons. The huge industrial wars of the 20th century, the First and Second World War, became, direct wars of that kind became much harder to have when the major powers became nuclear. But then they fought their wars by proxy, as they did in Southeast Asia, for example, or in Korea, or now in Yemen. So the number of actual physical casualties may have declined, but that again could be a short-term phenomenon, as if these conflicts spiral, kind of proxy wars spiral out of control. So what do people do when? Actually, what people do mostly when they really have their backs up against the wall and there's no way out for them is they revert, if you want to use that term, to traditional religion.
And they organize themselves, right? They organize themselves.
Yeah, but they very often. If they're up against the wall as a single isolated human being, or else as a family, and they can't organize themselves large scale,
right,
they very often, in fact mostly, take up traditional religion.